The summer of 1940 burned hot over southern England, but for the men of the Royal Air Force, the heat came not from the sun but from the constant roar of engines, the scream of sirens, and the thunder of warplanes tearing across the skies. Britain stood alone. France had fallen, and across the Channel, Hitler's forces massed like wolves waiting to pounce. The only thing standing between invasion and survival was a thin line of young pilots, the few. Flight Lieutenant James Hawke, Halstead adjusted his oxygen mask as his Spitfire climbed through the scattered clouds over Kent. At 23, he was already a veteran of Dunkirk, his steel-gray eyes hardened by the chaos he had witnessed. Yet no training, no briefing, could prepare him for the scale of what was now unfolding, the Battle of Britain. The radio crackled in his ears. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 20. Foam up, blue section. James tightened his grip on the control column. The calm voice belonged to squadron leader Richard Graves, a man both feared and respected. Graves had flown in the First World War and now, older and grizzled, carried himself like a hawk watching over fledglings. James often wondered if the man had any fear at all, or if he had simply outlived it. Ahead, the sky was dark with dots, hundreds of German aircraft, Heinkel bombers, their bellies fat with death, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Their formation stretched across the horizon like a storm front rolling in. James's heart pounded. He whispered to himself, "Steady, Hawke. Remember your training. Pick your target. Fire, then break." The Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF tore upward to meet the threat. The air became a churning storm of contrails, gunfire, and engines screaming at full throttle. The two forces clashed head-on. Tracer rounds streaked past James's canopy as he dived on a Heinkel. He pressed the trigger. His 8 Browning machine guns roared in unison, stitching fiery holes across the bomber's wing. Smoke billowed, the engine caught, and the aircraft spiraled earthward. James pulled hard left, but a Bf-109 latched onto his tail. Bullets shredded through his fuselage, the cockpit rattling with impacts. "Blue 3, you've got a Hun on you," Graves barked over the radio. James rolled his Spitfire, the world flipping upside down as he dove through cloud cover. The Messerschmitt followed, relentless. His vision blurred from the G-force, his hands shaking. Not like this. Not today. Suddenly, another Spitfire sliced down from above, guns blazing. The German fighter burst into flames, disintegrating in the sky. James exhaled in relief. "You owe me a pint, Hawke," came the voice of Tommy Barker, his childhood friend turned wingman. Tommy's humor, even in the jaws of death, steadied James's nerves. "Put it on my tab," James replied, forcing a grin. The battle raged for hours. Clouds of black smoke drifted over the countryside as burning aircraft, German and British alike, tumbled from the heavens. The southern coast was littered with wreckage, fields scarred by craters. Yet still, the Luftwaffe came, day after day, their numbers overwhelming. The RAF was stretched to the breaking point. Back at Biggin Hill Airfield, James staggered from his cockpit, sweat-soaked and trembling. Mechanics swarmed the damaged Spitfires, patching bullet holes with speed born of desperation. Inside the operations room, maps and phones buzzed endlessly. Britain was bleeding, and everyone knew it. That night, James sat in the mess with Tommy, nursing lukewarm tea. Around them, pilots laughed, smoked, and played cards, masking their fear. The truth hung unspoken in the air. Every dawn, some of them would not return. Tommy leaned in, his face serious for once. "James, if we don't hold the line, there'll be boots on English soil within weeks. My mum, your sister, they're counting on us." James nodded, the weight of it pressing on his chest. "We'll hold, Tommy. We have to." The following morning brought no respite. Radar screens lit up with fresh waves of incoming German aircraft, larger than any before. Graves gathered the squadron, his weathered face grave. "This is it, lads. They're throwing everything at us today. Remember, hold your fire until you're close. Protect the bombers at all costs. And for God's sake, watch each other's tails." James climbed back into his Spitfire, heart hammering. The engines roared, wheels lifted, and once again they rose into battle. The sky above London was a cauldron of fire. Heinkels rained bombs onto the city, plumes of smoke rising from factories, rail yards, even homes. Sirens wailed below as civilians huddled in shelters, praying the RAF could shield them. James and Tommy streaked through the chaos, diving on enemy bombers. Their guns tore through aluminum and glass, engines bursting into fireballs. But the Messerschmitts were everywhere, ruthless hunters cutting down RAF pilots one after another. Suddenly, a bomber broke through the defensive line, heading straight for the heart of London. James spotted it instantly, a Heinkel loaded heavy, flanked by 2 escorts. If it got through, the devastation would be catastrophic. "Blue 3, take it out." Graves' voice cut through the radio. "I'm on it," James replied, shoving the throttle forward. He dived on the formation, machine guns spitting fire. One escort peeled off smoking, but the other latched onto his tail. Tracers ripped across his wing, warning lights blinking red. James's Spitfire shuddered, instruments cracking. Still, he pressed on, locked onto the Heinkel's belly. "Tommy, I need cover," James yelled. There was no reply. He glanced back. Tommy's Spitfire was tumbling in flames, smoke trailing like a funeral shroud. James's stomach clenched, grief and rage surging. His best friend, his brother in arms, gone in an instant. But there was no time to mourn. The bomber loomed ahead. James lined up his sights, pressed the trigger. Bullets shredded the Heinkel's fuselage, puncturing its fuel tanks. Flames erupted across its wings, the massive bomber groaning as it began to fall. Its escort scattered, the sky tearing open with fire. The Heinkel plummeted toward the countryside, exploding in a thunderous bloom. London was safe, at least for today. But James's Spitfire was mortally wounded. Fuel leaked, smoke poured from the engine, controls sluggish. He fought the stick, coaxing the aircraft back toward friendly ground. His vision blurred, the world tilting. "Come on, Hawke," he whispered. "Don't give up now." At the last moment, he spotted a field. He cut the engine, pulled the nose up, and the Spitfire skidded across the grass, snapping its landing gear. The plane screeched to a halt, smoke rising. James unbuckled, tumbled to the ground, and lay there, gasping. Alive. In the days that followed, the Luftwaffe faltered. Losses mounted, their raids grew desperate, and Hitler postponed the invasion. The Battle of Britain was won, not by numbers or machines, but by the courage of a few who refused to yield. Standing at Tommy's empty bunk that night, James felt the bittersweet sting of victory. They had saved their island, but the cost was heavy. He whispered softly, "We did it, mate. We held the line." Above him, the night sky stretched endless and quiet, free, for now. And in that silence, the spirit of the few lived on. Battle of Britain. The summer of 1940 clung to England like a fever, hot and suffocating. For the men stationed at Biggin Hill, a Royal Air Force station southeast of London, the heat wasn't just in the air. It was in the silence between raids, in the drone of approaching engines, in the knowledge that every dawn might be their last. Flight Lieutenant James Hawke, Halstead leaned against the wing of his Spitfire, his eyes on the horizon where the Channel glittered faintly in the sunlight. Across that narrow strip of sea, less than 20 miles away, Hitler's armies waited like wolves. France had fallen in weeks, and Britain stood alone. James was only 23, but his face carried years of weariness. He had flown at Dunkirk, watching thousands of men scramble onto boats under fire, the sand running red with blood. He had sworn then that if Britain was to be the last bastion, he would fight until his bones gave way. The airfield hummed with tension. Mechanics worked tirelessly, patching bullet holes, refueling, checking ammunition belts. The smell of oil and sweat hung thick. Inside the barracks, pilots dozed on wooden chairs, boots still on, waiting for the next scramble order. Cigarette smoke curled through the mess, mingling with nervous laughter. James lit one himself, taking a drag just as a familiar voice broke his thoughts. "Daydreaming again, Hawke? You'll get yourself shot down one of these days." He turned to see Tommy Barker, his childhood friend, striding across the tarmac. At 22, Tommy was the joker of the squadron, his sandy hair perpetually untidy, grin never far away. He and James had grown up in Sussex, flying kites together on the cliffs as boys. Now, instead of kites, they flew Spitfires, and instead of laughter, they chased death. James smirked faintly. "I was imagining what it'll be like once this is all over." Pint at the village pub, no sirens, no bloody Germans overhead. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. Then you'd best stay alive to drink it. You still owe me for last week. Before James could reply, a sharp whistle split the air. Pilots! Ops room! They jogged with the others toward the bunker. Inside, the air was thick with urgency. Maps stretched across the wall, pins marking enemy movements. Phones rang constantly as the doubting system, radar, observers, controllers, tracked the Luftwaffe's advance. At the head of the room stood squadron leader Richard Graves, their commander. He was a tall, gaunt man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter frost. Unlike most of his men, he had fought before, over the fields of France in the First World War. Stories of his cold precision in the cockpit had become legend among the younger pilots. "Gentlemen," Graves began, his voice gravel and iron, "the Hun is on his way. A formation of Heinkel bombers, heavy escorts, heading straight for Kent. Our job is to intercept before they reach the docks. Remember, stay tight, protect each other's tails, and don't waste your ammunition. You'll only get one chance before they swamp you." His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on James. "Once you're in the air, discipline keeps you alive. Not bravado. Discipline." A tense silence followed, broken only by the clatter of boots as the pilots moved out. James felt the adrenaline begin to rise in his veins. His mouth went dry. He wasn't afraid of dying, at least, that's what he told himself. What gnawed at him was the thought of failing. Letting bombers through. Watching cities burn because he wasn't good enough. Minutes later, engines roared to life. The Spitfires lined the runway, sunlight gleaming off their sleek frames. James climbed into his cockpit, hands moving by instinct, straps tight, oxygen mask secure, guns armed. He glanced across at Tommy, who gave him a cheeky thumbs up. James managed a tight grin in return. The signal flare went up. "Blue section, wheels up," Graves' voice came over the radio, calm as stone. The Spitfires leapt forward, engines screaming. The ground fell away, the world opening into endless blue. James's stomach tightened as they climbed higher, cloud swallowing them, the air cold and thin. He could already hear the faint hum of engines to the south, the Luftwaffe, coming like a storm. The radio crackled. "Enemy sighted. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 20. James's eyes scanned the horizon. Then he saw them. Dots at first, then growing shapes, until the sky seemed filled with them. Dozens upon dozens of German bombers, sleek Heinkel 111s, their wings glittering in the sun. Above and beside them, like wolves circling sheep, flew the Messerschmitt 109s, their sharp noses glinting. It was a sight that could freeze the blood. A dark cloud rolling toward England, carrying death. James swallowed hard. So this is it. "All sections, engage," Graves commanded. The RAF formation broke apart, Spitfires and Hurricanes diving, contrails streaking behind them. The battle was joined in an instant, machine guns chattering, engines roaring, the sky erupting in fire. James locked onto a bomber, his thumb tightening on the trigger. 8 Brownings thundered, tracers lacing across the sky. He saw sparks rip across the enemy's wing, smoke belching from its engine. The Heinkel staggered, falling from formation. But even as he pulled up, bullets ripped past his canopy, Messerschmitt on his tail. James rolled hard, the world spinning. His stomach lurched, G-forces crushing his chest. "Blue 3, you've got a Hun on you," Graves barked. James gritted his teeth, twisting and diving. Tracers hissed by, one tearing through his wing. The Spitfire rattled, alarms screaming. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced it down. He yanked the stick, diving into cloud cover. The Messerschmitt followed. Not like this. Not today. Then, like a hawk from the sun, another Spitfire plunged down. Guns flared, and the Messerschmitt exploded in a ball of fire. James gasped in relief. "You owe me a pint, Hawke," Tommy's voice laughed over the radio. James exhaled shakily, forcing a grin. "Put it on my tab." The sky above Kent was chaos, planes burning, falling, twisting in desperate duels. The earth below was dotted with fires, villages shaking as bombs fell. And this was only the beginning. The battle that day lasted less than an hour, but for James Halstead it felt like a lifetime. When his Spitfire's wheels finally kissed the tarmac of Biggin Hill, the airfield was already a maelstrom. Ambulances rushing, mechanics scrambling, fire crews dousing smoking wrecks that hadn't quite made it home. James climbed out of his cockpit, legs trembling. His hands were still locked in the shape of the control column. He pried them free with effort, each muscle aching from the strain of violent turns. The smell of burned oil and cordite clung to him like a second skin. Tommy Barker landed just moments after him, bouncing from his Spitfire with his usual grin. He pulled off his helmet and shook out his hair as though he'd just returned from a Sunday drive. "Well," Tommy said, patting James's shoulder. "That was lively, wasn't it? I reckon you sweated out at least 3 pints up there." James tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. His ears still rang with the sound of gunfire, and when he blinked, he saw again the burning German bomber spinning earthward. He had killed men today, strangers who, like him, had climbed into their cockpits with orders, with fear, with perhaps even a picture of family tucked into their jackets. The mess that evening was heavy with smoke and silence. They had lost 4 pilots in that sortie. 4 bunks that would remain empty, for men whose voices would never again echo in the mess. Graves read the casualty list with the flat, clipped tone of a man who had seen too much of death. No eulogy, no sentiment, just names. James pushed his tea around the rim of his cup, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Tommy, beside him, leaned back and tried to fill the silence. "They'll be singing songs about us in London soon, you mark my words. The few who saved the many, or something like that." James finally looked at him. "Do you really believe that, Tommy? Or are you just trying to keep the rest of us from falling apart?" Tommy smirked, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Maybe both. Truth is, mate, we don't have the luxury of falling apart." James nodded slowly, though the weight on his chest remained. He thought of his sister, Ellen, living in London, working in a factory. Each time the sirens wailed, she must wonder if the RAF would hold the line. He wondered what she'd think if she saw him today, covered in soot, shaking, with blood spattered across his flight jacket, his or someone else's, he didn't even know. Dawn broke with the shriek of sirens. The men tumbled from their bunks, pulling on flight suits as runners burst in shouting, "Raid incoming! Scramble!" The field erupted. Engines coughed to life, propellers whipping up dust. James strapped in, lungs tight with anticipation. The routine was becoming familiar, oxygen mask secure, harness tight, radio crackling with orders, but the fear never lessened. If anything, it grew heavier with each flight, each empty bunk. The squadron lifted into the pale morning sky. Radar had picked up a large formation approaching from the channel, bigger than yesterday. "Blue section, climb to Angels 15, Graves' voice ordered, as calm as if he were reciting weather reports. The Spitfires clawed upward, engines howling. And then, there they were again, the Luftwaffe. Heinkels in formation, their black crosses stark against silver wings, their bellies heavy with bombs. Escorts swarmed above, Messerschmitts like hawks circling prey. All sections, engage. The two sides collided in a storm of fire. James dove on a bomber, tracers sparking across its fuselage. The Heinkels gunners answered, bullets hammering his canopy, glass shattering in tiny spiderweb cracks. He pulled up sharply, rolled, then came down again, this time catching the bomber's engine. Smoke poured out, and the plane fell from formation, dropping toward the channel. But a Messerschmitt swept in behind him, guns blazing. Alarms shrieked in his cockpit. "Hawke, brake left." Tommy's voice barked. James yanked the stick. The Spitfire groaned under the G-force. Tommy shot past him like a silver dart, guns roaring. The Messerschmitt burst apart, fragments tumbling through the sky. "You're bloody hopeless without me," Tommy quipped. James let out a shaky breath. "Remind me to buy you that pint if we live through this." The fight raged. Planes fell like burning meteors into fields and rivers. The roar of engines and rattle of machine guns merged into a single endless thunder. James found himself locked in a turning duel with another 109, both spiraling tighter and tighter, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Sweat poured down his back, his vision narrowing. He saw the German pilot's face for an instant, young, determined, maybe as frightened as he was. Then James squeezed the trigger. Tracers stitched across the 109's nose, and it erupted in flame. The German bailed out, chute blossoming below. James felt a pang of guilt, but the relief of still being alive drowned it out. When they finally limped back to Biggin Hill, James's Spitfire was riddled with holes, one wheel barely holding. He staggered out, adrenaline still burning through his veins. The field was chaos again, ambulances, fires, missing men. In the operations room, Graves stood over the map, jaw clenched. "We're holding them, for now. But they'll be back, and in greater numbers. They know the docks are our lifeline." James sank into a chair, exhaustion swallowing him whole. His ears still rang with the screams of engines, the bursts of gunfire. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he clenched them into fists. Tommy sat beside him, a quietness rare for him. After a long silence, he spoke. "James, what if we don't make it through this?" James looked at him, startled. Tommy was usually all laughter, all bravado. To hear fear in his voice shook him more than any dogfight. "We will," James said firmly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "We have to. If we don't, there'll be boots on English soil. My sister, your mum, everything we love, it'll be gone." Tommy stared at the table, then nodded slowly. "Then we fight. Until the last drop of fuel, until the last bullet." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, Ellen, smiling in the garden back home. He stared at it, then tucked it back into his jacket. The room was quiet, the weight of loss and expectation pressing on every man. Yet in that silence, a bond grew. They were not just pilots, they were shields, standing alone between their people and annihilation. Outside, the night was split by the wail of distant sirens. London burned. And tomorrow, the battle would begin again. The days blurred into one another, raids at dawn, scrambling at noon, alarms at midnight. The Luftwaffe came in waves, relentless, and the men at Biggin Hill fought until their eyes burned and their bodies shook. James Hawke, Halstead lost count of the sorties. He lost count of the kills, too. What he didn't lose count of were the empty bunks. Every morning, the mess hall was a little quieter. Someone's laughter missing, someone's seat left cold. On the 7th day of raids, squadron leader Richard Graves summoned James to his office. The walls were bare save for a faded photograph of biplanes from 1918. Graves sat stiff-backed behind his desk, hands clasped, his expression carved from stone. "Sit down, Halstead." James obeyed, uneasy. "You've flown more missions than most of your section," Graves began, his voice low. "And you've come back. That's no small thing." James said nothing. Praise from Graves was rare, and he wasn't sure where this was going. Graves leaned forward, his cold eyes locking onto James. "Survival up there isn't about being the best shot. It's about discipline. About keeping your head when everything around you is burning. You've shown that." James frowned slightly. "Are you saying I'm fit for command, sir?" Graves' gaze hardened. "I'm saying your men need an anchor. Barker looks up to you. The others do, too. You may not like it, but you carry weight now. If you falter, they falter." The words sank like stones in James's stomach. Command. He hadn't asked for it. He wasn't sure he wanted it. But he knew Graves was right. That afternoon, the sirens screamed again. Radar reported another incoming formation, larger than before. The airfield shook with urgency as pilots strapped in, mechanics scrambled, and engines thundered to life. James climbed into his Spitfire, Graves' words echoing in his head. "If you falter, they falter." The sky over Kent was already a battlefield. Columns of smoke rose from the countryside where bombs had fallen. When the squadron climbed through the clouds, James's breath caught. The horizon was filled with aircraft. Dozens of Heinkels and Dorniers, swarms of Messerschmitts circling them like a steel shield. It was the largest raid yet. "All sections, engage," Graves ordered. The RAF tore into the formation. Tracers laced the air, wings shredded, engines flamed. The bombers pressed onward, determined, while the escorts pounced on the defenders with ruthless precision. James locked onto a Dornier, his guns spitting fire. The bomber shuddered, smoke billowing from its engine. It began to fall, but before he could pull away, A Messerschmitt dove at him from above. Bullets ripped past his canopy, sparks flying. "Blue 3, you've got company," Tommy's voice shouted. "I see him." James yanked the stick, rolling hard. The Spitfire groaned under the strain. The Messerschmitt followed, matching every move. James felt sweat sting his eyes. Then, out of nowhere, another 109 cut across his path, painted jet black, its nose marked with a snarling wolf's head. Its maneuvers were razor-sharp, its guns deadly accurate. "Bloody hell," James muttered. He'd heard rumors of him, the Black Wolf of the Luftwaffe, an ace who had downed dozens of RAF pilots. Some said he was Göring's personal hound. The Black Wolf came at him head-on, guns blazing. James twisted aside, tracers slicing past his wing. The duel became a deadly dance, each maneuver countered, each shot barely evaded. For long minutes, the two fighters circled, lunged, rolled. The Wolf's skill was terrifying. James's arms ached from holding the controls, his lungs burned. Finally, he saw an opening. The Wolf overshot slightly, and James pressed the trigger, only to hear the sickening click of empty guns. His ammo was gone. "Damn it!" The Messerschmitt roared past, guns blazing. James ducked low, using clouds as cover, heart hammering. He had to disengage, live to fight another day. He dove, his Spitfire shuddering as it plunged. The Wolf followed, but the clouds swallowed them both. James twisted, rolled, prayed. And then, silence. He'd lost him. Shaking, gasping, James broke from the clouds and limped back toward Biggin Hill. He landed with his fuselage riddled, his guns empty, his nerves shredded. As he staggered from the cockpit, Graves was waiting, arms crossed. "You met him," Graves said flatly. James blinked. "The Wolf." Graves nodded once. "I flew against men like him in France. Aces who fight not with machines, but with instinct. They kill because it's all they know." His jaw tightened. "He'll come for you again." James swallowed hard, the memory of the Wolf's eyes burning in his mind. That night, the mess was subdued. 4 more bunks were empty. The men sat in silence, cigarettes glowing, tea cooling untouched. Tommy finally broke it. "That Wolf fellow, did you really see him?" James nodded grimly. Tommy whistled. "Well, if anyone can take him, it's you." James shook his head. "I barely made it back. He's better than me. Better than any of us." Graves' voice cut in from the shadows. "Skill isn't everything. The Germans fight for orders. You fight for home. That's what gives you the edge, if you remember it." The room fell silent again, but James felt a spark kindle in his chest. Fear, yes, but also resolve. The next dawn brought no respite. The Luftwaffe came again, bombing docks, airfields, factories. London burned, smoke rising like funeral pyres. James led Blue Section into the fray, his men's lives tied to his commands. Graves' words echoed, "If you falter, they falter." He kept his voice steady over the radio, guiding his section, covering their flanks, pulling them out of danger. He felt the weight of every decision, but he also felt their trust. And as the day bled into night, James realized something. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a leader. But in the shadows of the burning city, the Black Wolf waited. By early September, the war reached London itself. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by the stubborn resistance of the RAF, shifted its fury onto the capital. Night after night, the city burned. Factories, warehouses, homes, nothing was spared. The orange glow of flames could be seen even from Biggin Hill. For James Halstead, it was no longer just an abstract fight in the skies. His sister Ellen lived in the East End. Each time the sirens wailed, he wondered if she would see the morning. Each time the bombers slipped through, his stomach twisted with helpless guilt. On the 7th evening of raids, the order came down, intercept over London. The squadron gathered on the tarmac, the air heavy with smoke drifting from the south. Sirens wailed in the distance. Graves stood before them, his silhouette sharp against the burning horizon. "The city is their target tonight," he said. "We stop them here, or London burns to the ground. Remember your training. Watch each other's tails. And whatever happens, hold the line." James strapped into his Spitfire, jaw clenched. Tommy Barker leaned from his cockpit, shouting over the engines. "Think Ellen's watching from her shelter? We'd best give her a show." James forced a grim smile. "Let's just give her another day alive." The engines roared, and they climbed into the night sky. The sight that greeted them stole James's breath. The Thames was a silver ribbon, but the city around it blazed like a furnace. Bombs had already fallen, warehouses along the docks were ablaze, smoke rising in columns. And above it, the Luftwaffe came in endless waves, Heinkel's and Dornier bombers in tight formation, flanked by Messerschmitts darting like sharks around them. Graves' voice came calm and sharp. "All sections, engage." The Spitfires and Hurricanes dove into the fray. Machine guns roared, tracers streaked across the black sky. The darkness lit with explosions as planes caught fire and tumbled into the inferno below. James locked onto a bomber, his tracers ripping across its fuselage. The Heinkel's wing burst into flame, the giant craft spiraling into the river. Another bomber loomed, but suddenly, a Messerschmitt dropped onto James's tail, rounds hammering his fuselage. "Blue 3, break right." Tommy's voice shouted. James obeyed, feeling the plane shudder as bullets tore through the tail. Tommy swooped down, guns blazing, shredding the German fighter. It erupted in fire. "That's twice I've saved your hide this week," Tommy crowed. James managed a shaky laugh. "I'll be buying you drinks for the rest of my life." But the battle was merciless. The sky was alive with fire and smoke, engines screaming, the stench of burning fuel filling James's lungs even through his mask. Below, London shook with each impact, whole streets vanishing in firestorms. Then James saw it, a massive Heinkel formation pushing through, heading straight for the heart of the city. Factories, rail yards, civilian neighborhoods. "Blue section, with me," James barked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We cut them off here." They dove, guns blazing, raking the bombers with fire. Two went down, then another, but the formation pressed on. In the chaos, James caught a flash of black against the moonlight. His stomach tightened, the Black Wolf. The German ace banked smoothly, sliding behind a Spitfire, Tommy's Spitfire. "Tommy, break! Break now!" James shouted. Tommy rolled, but the Wolf was faster. Tracers ripped across his fuselage. Flames erupted along the wing. "James!" Tommy's voice cracked over the radio. She's not holding." The Spitfire lurched, trailing smoke, tumbling end over end. "No. Pull up, Tommy. Pull up!" James cried. For a heartbeat, he saw Tommy's silhouette in the cockpit, struggling with the controls. Then the Spitfire plummeted, exploding in a field outside the city. Silence filled James's headset. His chest constricted, rage and grief surging together. "Tommy!" But there was no answer. The Wolf turned on James, guns flashing. James yanked his Spitfire into a desperate roll, fury giving him strength. He twisted, dove, climbed, the two fighters locked in a deadly duel above the burning city. Tracers sliced past his canopy. James snapped into a dive, then pulled up hard, the G-force threatening to tear him apart. The Wolf matched every move. "Come on, you bastard," James muttered, jaw clenched. He lined up his sights, fired, a burst that clipped the Wolf's wing but didn't kill him. The German peeled away, vanishing into the night, leaving James trembling with rage. When he landed at Biggin Hill hours later, dawn was already breaking. Smoke still rose from the horizon. The airfield was silent. Mechanics moved like ghosts. Graves met him at the tarmac, his eyes grave. "Barker." James shook his head, unable to speak. Graves put a hand on his shoulder, firm but heavy. He knew the risk. "We all do." James turned away, his fists clenched. His chest ached as if the sky itself had collapsed inside him. Tommy was more than a friend. He was family, a brother in arms who had carried him through fear with laughter. And now he was gone, cut down by the Wolf. That night, James sat alone in the mess. Tommy's bunk was empty. His laughter was gone. James pulled out the photograph of Ellen, staring at her smile. "I'll keep fighting," he whispered. "For her. For Tommy. For all of them." Outside, London still burned. The war was far from over. But James's resolve had hardened. The Black Wolf had taken his friend. One day, James swore, he would return the favor. The days that followed Tommy's death felt like an endless blur. For James Halstead, the war had shifted. It was no longer about medals, sorties, or even survival. It was about vengeance, about carrying the weight of those who had fallen. Every time he walked past Tommy's empty bunk, the silence screamed louder than any engine roar. The Luftwaffe pressed harder than ever. Day after day, wave after wave of bombers crossed the channel, their escorts sweeping the skies like vultures. Biggin Hill itself was under constant attack. Craters pocked the runway, hangars were reduced to smoking shells, and crews worked by hand to patch holes between raids. And yet, every morning, Graves stood before the squadron, steady as a rock. His voice never wavered, though James could see the lines deepening in his weathered face. "Gentlemen," Graves said one grim dawn, "every hour you hold them off is another hour Britain lives. You know what that means. You know why we fly." The men nodded, but James could see it in their eyes. They were all fraying at the edges. By mid-September, intelligence warned of a decisive strike. The Luftwaffe was gathering everything they had, the largest formation yet, a final hammer blow to break the RAF and leave Britain defenseless. When the scramble came, James felt his heart pound as if it would crack his ribs. Engines roared, Spitfires and Hurricanes tearing down the runway, climbing into the pale morning sky. "Blue section, form up." Graves' calm voice cut through the static. James's hands trembled on the controls. He glanced at Tommy's old place in formation, empty. A cold fury settled in his chest. Ahead, the horizon darkened with the sight of them, hundreds of bombers, stretching in endless rows, their shadows crawling across the sea. And circling above, their fangs, the Messerschmitt fighters, sleek and deadly. The final test had come. The RAF hurled itself at the formation. The sky erupted into chaos, a storm of fire and steel. Hurricanes tore into the bombers while Spitfires clashed with fighters above. Engines screamed, guns rattled, and parachutes blossomed like ghostly flowers in the smoke-filled sky. James dove straight into the maelstrom. He shredded a Heinkel with a burst, its engines exploding, the giant bomber falling in pieces. But even as he pulled up, a shadow loomed, smooth, precise, merciless. The Black Wolf. The German ace slid in behind him with surgical precision, rounds hammering past James's canopy. James yanked the stick, his Spitfire shuddering as he twisted through the chaos. "Wolf's on me," James shouted into the radio, but no answer came. Everyone was locked in their own desperate fights. The duel began. The Wolf pressed him ruthlessly, every maneuver answered, every escape blocked. James dove through bomber formations, weaving between tracers and falling debris. The Wolf stayed glued to him, a predator locked on its prey. James's arms ached with the strain, sweat stinging his eyes. His plane rattled, bullet holes puncturing the wings. But he remembered Graves' words, "Don't fight the plane. Fight the man." James forced his breathing calm. He pictured Tommy's face, that lopsided grin, the promise he had made. He could not, would not, let the Wolf end him here. He snapped his Spitfire into a sudden climb, engine screaming, the G-force crushing him into his seat. The Wolf followed, just as James had gambled. At the peak, James stalled his engine, letting the Spitfire shudder and fall into a controlled spin. The Wolf shot past, overshooting. For the first time, the Predator was exposed. James fired. The tracers found their mark. The Wolf's Messerschmitt shuddered, smoke billowing from its engine. The German tried to roll away, but James pressed the attack, teeth bared, every bullet carrying Tommy's name. The Messerschmitt burst into flame. It spiraled downward, vanishing in a pillar of black smoke over the fields of Kent. James let out a ragged breath, chest heaving. The Wolf was gone. Tommy was avenged. But there was no time to savor it. The bombers were still pressing toward London. James rallied what was left of Blue Section, diving on the formation with everything they had. Tracer fire laced the sky, wings snapped, engines exploded. One by one, the bombers fell, until at last the survivors began to break formation, turning back across the channel. The raid was broken. London stood. James's Spitfire, riddled with holes, limped back toward base. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died altogether. With a prayer on his lips, he guided it down, wheels scraping a farmer's field. The crash tore through the undercarriage, but when the dust settled, James was alive. He climbed from the wreck, his legs trembling, smoke rising on the horizon. Overhead, the last German planes were retreating. The RAF had held the line. That night at Biggin Hill, the men gathered in silence. The squadron was a fraction of what it had been. Too many bunks were empty. Too many voices silenced. Graves stood among them, his face lit by the faint glow of a lantern. "They threw their worst at us today," he said softly. "And we're still here. That's what matters. History may forget our names, but it will never forget what we did here." James sat apart, staring at Tommy's empty chair. He raised his mug in a quiet toast. "To you, brother," he whispered. "We held the line. Just like we promised." The night was still, save for the distant rumble of London's fires. But for the first time in weeks, James looked up at the dark sky and saw more than smoke and flames. He saw stars. The longest day was over. Britain still stood. And so long as there were men willing to fly, it always would. The morning after the great raid, the air over Kent was eerily quiet. No engines, no bombers, no screams of metal tearing through the sky. Just silence, broken only by the caw of distant crows circling above scarred fields. James Halstead stood beside the wreck of his Spitfire in that farmer's field, the sun rising over its battered frame. Mechanics would later tow it back to Biggin Hill, but for now it lay there like a wounded beast that had given everything. James rested a hand on its scorched wing. "You brought me home," he murmured. A lorry came rattling down the dirt road, RAF crew waving him aboard. James climbed in, his body aching, his uniform streaked with oil and smoke. The ride back to base was quiet. Every man was lost in his own thoughts. They had survived, but only just. Biggin Hill bore the scars of war more than ever. Hangars reduced to twisted metal, fuel trucks burned to husks, runways cratered and patched with whatever concrete could be poured in time. Pilots shuffled about, exhausted, hollow-eyed. Graves was there, greeting the returning airmen, his face unreadable. James saluted. "Halstead," Graves said. "Heard you gave the wolf his final howl." James swallowed, unsure whether to feel pride or emptiness. "He's gone, sir." Graves nodded. "Good. That one's been a thorn in our side long enough." Then his expression softened. "You did well. You all did. London still stands because of you." The words should have felt like triumph. Instead, James looked at the empty spaces where Tommy and others should have stood, their laughter missing from the air. Victory had been bought dearly. That night, Londoners lit candles in their windows. Despite the ruins, despite the fires still smoldering from the raids, there was defiance in every flicker of light. James and a few pilots had been granted leave, and he found himself walking the streets of the battered city. Children played in the rubble as if it were a playground, their innocence untouched by the bombs. Women queued for rations with quiet determination. And from somewhere down a side street, a voice began singing softly, "There'll always be an England." Soon, others joined in, the melody rising above the destruction. James stopped in his tracks. For the first time since Dunkirk, he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't dared to hope for. Not just survival. Not just vengeance. Hope. Back at Biggin Hill, Graves called the squadron together one final time that September. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the battered mess hall, "the Luftwaffe is pulling back. They've thrown everything at us, and it wasn't enough. The invasion has been postponed, indefinitely." There was no cheer, no roar of triumph. The men were too weary for that. But there was a ripple of quiet relief, shoulders easing, breaths released. Graves looked at them each in turn, his eyes fierce. History will remember these weeks. When the world stood on the edge of darkness, it was you, the few, who held the line. Never forget that. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. He raised a glass. "To the few." Every man echoed him, glasses lifted in silence. James's hand trembled slightly as he raised his own, the weight of Tommy's absence pressing against his chest. "To the few," he whispered. In the days that followed, James visited a small graveyard on the outskirts of Kent, where many of the fallen pilots had been laid to rest. A simple wooden cross marked Tommy Barker's resting place, the soil still fresh. James knelt, placing a small RAF badge he had kept in his pocket at the foot of the cross. "You'd have hated all this ceremony," James said softly. "But you deserved more than anyone." He sat there for a long while, listening to the wind in the trees, remembering their last conversation in the mess, Tommy joking about marrying some girl from home when the war was over. James blinked hard, forcing back the sting in his eyes. "I'll fly for both of us now," he whispered. "Always." By October, the skies were clearer. The bombers came less often, their raids smaller, less coordinated. The RAF, battered but unbroken, stood taller with each passing day. Across Britain, the people walked with a little more confidence, knowing the storm had been weathered. James continued flying sorties, though they were fewer and shorter. He noticed the quiet moments more, the way sunlight glinted off his canopy, the feel of the stick steady in his hands, the hum of the Merlin engine when it purred smoothly. He flew not just to fight, but to remember why they had fought at all. One evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and crimson, James sat outside the dispersal hut with Graves. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Graves broke the silence. "War's far from over," Graves said. "But you should be proud, Halstead. You were part of something bigger than all of us." James looked up at the sky, now quiet, the contrails gone. "I don't feel proud, sir. I just feel lucky. Lucky to still be here when so many aren't." Graves nodded. "That's the truth of it. Survival in war isn't glory, it's chance. But you make that chance mean something." The old commander rose, placing a hand on James's shoulder before walking away, leaving James alone with the fading light. That night, James lay awake, staring out at the stars. For the first time in months, the sky was peaceful. No drone of bombers, no streaks of fire, no thunder of engines. Just stillness. He thought of Tommy. Of all the men who would never see another dawn. Of the civilians who had endured firestorms and rubble. Of Graves, carrying his squadron through sheer will. And then he thought of the promise he had made to himself, to keep flying, to carry the memory of the few into whatever came next. The war was not over. The world was still burning. But Britain stood, unbowed, because they had endured. Because they had fought in the skies and refused to fall. James closed his eyes, the words of Graves echoing in his mind. "Every hour you hold them off is another hour Britain lives." The Battle of Britain was over. They had held. And so long as men like James drew breath, Britain would live.